I do hope by now that you've realised that here at Konnect Radio, we do things differently. You know, we never shy away from those difficult questions. Everybody on air, presenter-wise, that we have is a Christian. But that doesn't mean that we don't have our struggles. It doesn't mean that we don't wake up in a morning and think, you know, this happening at the moment in my life, in other people's lives around the world, it's awful. Why is God allowing this to happen? And to be honest, I think doubt is healthy. In fact, Tom confirmed that a few weeks ago, that we all have doubts. It doesn't matter if you're a member of OCCA, if you're a doctorate in theology, we all have those questions. And I think it's just human nature. So it's our job as a radio station to bring on people who can help us tackle those difficult questions, which is why we've got Tom Price with us right now. And a nice, easy one for us this morning, Tom, because we're asking the question, does God exist? Over to you.
So thank you, Gareth. I think this is one of the most important questions. Does God exist? How can we know that God is real? Is God real? And people might approach this in different ways. Some people might sort of just dismiss it and say, well, you can't know. There's no way you can know. It's just a matter of faith. Other people might adopt an approach a bit more like Sherlock Holmes, where they'll try to carefully sift through the clues. And I'd like to take us down that road, not to compel us to have faith in God, but to gently appeal to us to think, has he left the fingerprints or clues of his existence around us to interest us, to perhaps win us, to get us to think more deeply about whether or not we would be interested in knowing him. But before I do that, let me just point out what is at stake here potentially. What difference would it make? What if God was real? Well, if God was real, if God is actually in existence, then that could potentially mean that there is a real hope after the end of our lives. It could mean that there's a hope going through tough times in our lives. It could mean that somebody is with us all the time, supporting us personally, in a living, loving, accepting friendship with God. It could also mean that there's the possibility of transformation and change in our lives. And it could also mean that the problem of our own nature, our own selfishness, our own tendencies, that has the possibility of transformation around it too. At least in the Christian view of God, God doesn't come just to leave us as we are, but to change us and to transform us. And as we receive forgiveness from him in that friendship, then we become transformed. But let me try to point towards the sorts of clues that I think might interest somebody like Sherlock Holmes as he looks through and tries to work out what clues might there be to God's existence or not. You can point to lots of different things at this point. There are loads of different arguments. I think I could think of about 25 or 30 different arguments or clues. Arguments, just the word that philosophers use to talk about reasoning towards a conclusion. So I think we could talk about 30 or so different clues towards God's existence. Maybe we should have a chat about each of these in turn, but let me just sort of go through 4 of them quickly. So the universe, human morality, looking at human beings, is the second one. Jesus's identity himself. And then fourthly, the 4th clue is through our own experience and living out that life, experiencing God personally. So the first one, the universe. So cosmologists tell us and explain to us that our universe, there's the origin of the universe. It doesn't go back forever and ever and ever and ever, even if we understand it to be a universe that comes from, say, a multiverse scenario. You still have to have some pre-existing conditions, and they don't go back and back and back forever and ever. You still need a prime mover. So that's the first clue. The fact that there isn't an infinite regress of causes, that there is the bare fact of the universe. How did it come into existence? the hunt for the big banger, the prime mover, or the first cause? Was it just natural processes like electric charges, energy, gravity, or is the best explanation for that some kind of agent like God caused the universe? Second type of clue here within this sphere of the universe is that the universe that we find ourselves in, this universe that exists, has an extraordinary amount of fine-tuning within it. It's finely tuned for life. There are lots of things that are unlikely to happen in life. For example, if you were playing cards and you played a game of poker and you saw somebody playing and hand after hand, and they won royal flush, royal flush, royal flush in a row. Let's say they did 10 royal flushes in a row. Now, the chance of that is incredibly, incredibly unlikely. Now, anybody would say, looking at that, oh my goodness, there's cheating going on. And in the same sort of way, the chance of our universe being life permitting, of it not having other finely tuned principles in physics that are slightly different, that is, the chance of our universe actually allowing life is incredibly small. It's much, much slimmer than all those royal flushes or winning the lottery over and over and over again. So anybody who is sort of thinking about this needs to start with that fact. So you might start with the sort of principle of knowledge here, that if something looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it tastes like a duck, or if it swims like a duck, let's say, then it's reasonable to say it's a duck. And so we ought to believe that things are as they seem to be until we have evidence that we're mistaken. And in the same sort of way, if the universe is finely tuned, if it really does seem finely tuned, and if you would say that you saw that sort of same chance operating in a poker game with the royal flushes or winning the lottery over and over again, then you'd say something else is going on. Then in the same sort of way, perhaps we should say that the conclusion, therefore, is that the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, is an element of design. So we ought to believe that things are as they seem to be until we have evidence that we're mistaken. The fine-tuning of the Big Bang seems like it's designed. And the conclusion then is, therefore, in the absence of sufficient counter-evidence, the best explanation is that the universe is designed. The fine-tuning of the universe is designed. So in its causal moment and in its fine-tuning. So now looking at human beings, the clue here, I think, is in the way that human beings believe and have an idea of right and wrong. But we have a particular type of understanding of right and wrong. If we think of Martin Luther King, we think of the history of slavery in the world as well. And then we think of the moment, this isn't a political comment, but if we think of the moment where Barack Obama became president of the United States, there is an incredible journey of African Americans, of people who were treated very unjustly. There's an incredible journey there of moral progress, not for those individuals, but for the society in actually opening up and growing in those ways. And I think this indicates that moral progress can occur. Now, this is itself interesting because you can't progress if there's nothing to progress towards. And so we do believe that societies can be better or worse. We sometimes look at what's happening around the world and say that shouldn't be happening. We're past that now. That shouldn't be happening to women. That shouldn't be happening to children. That shouldn't be happening to people of different backgrounds and histories. And we all share these values as well. We share these values that some things are just wrong. In an interview between Justin Brierley, the unbelievable radio host from Premier, he asked Richard Dawkins whether his belief that rape is wrong is arbitrary. Is it as arbitrary as the fact that we've perhaps evolved with 5 fingers rather than 6, which is something that Richard Dawkins might believe? And Richard Dawkins says, yes, you could say that, yes. So there's this sense that our values are kind of more concrete than that, though, that they're not just arbitrary, they're real, and that we can have moral progress within them. And our moral values also are cross-cultural. The way we view right and wrong is cross-cultural. We don't look at one society and say, we don't really think, okay, they can kill people in that society and that's okay. Instead, we have international tribunals of human rights, which make judgments about whether or not things are right and wrong. And we do judge as other cultures. So if we look at morality, we look at its nature, the nature of how progress is possible within moral values, right and wrong. If we look at how moral values themselves are cross-cultural, they go across cultures, and they create these obligations, these powers on us that make us want to behave in line with them. And we also find that moral values themselves are not arbitrary, but they're meaningful. They're real features of the universe. They're not just like having 6 fingers rather than 5. Actually, God provides a basis, a stable basis that doesn't collapse for those things. It isn't just arbitrary and meaningless. Actually, those things have value because they're linked to and flow from God's character, at least goodness does. So then the third clue, just quickly, is Jesus himself. No other religion, says Anthony Flew, the former atheist who became a deist, no other religion has anything like the combination of a charismatic figure like Jesus or a first-class intellectual like St. Paul. And if you're wanting God or omnipotence to set up a religion, then it seems to me that this is the one to beat. And Anthony Flew changed his mind about God towards the end of his life. He was like the godfather of atheism, and he was absolutely intrigued by Jesus and by the case and the arguments around the evidence for Jesus's resurrection. There are 2 aspects to Jesus, really. There's who was he, and then there's the evidence for the resurrection, from his resurrection from the dead. So Jesus himself taught and explained that he was God, that he was revealing God to human beings. And he substantiated these claims with his teaching, with his insights, with his fulfillment of prophecies outside of his control, like the manner of his birth and the manner of his death. He also did miracles. He demonstrated his character. He did all kinds of things which substantiated his own claim that his identity wasn't just merely human, but was also God come to us. Was he telling the truth? Was he lying? Was he somebody who was deluded about who he was? He doesn't seem like he was a deluded person. He doesn't seem like he was a person who had was sort of unstable in that way, in the way that he saw himself. Instead, the most reasonable conclusion seems to be that he actually was telling the truth, and he believed and gave evidence for why he thought he was God, and other people did believe him. He didn't seem to be a bad or evil person who was lying about that. He didn't have actually very many followers in his lifetime. He didn't seem to be interested in just getting people to follow him. He made it very hard for people to follow him. And so C.S. Lewis says, either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. And then there's the evidence for his resurrection, which I don't have time to go into fully here, but a number of important facts need explaining here. The empty tomb, the crucifixion of Jesus, the transformation of people like the Saul, who became Paul, who were persecuting the early church, and then the explosive growth of the early church. Some sort of hypothesis is needed, which doesn't disregard any of those facts, but explains those facts. And the idea that Jesus rose from the dead, that God raised Jesus from the dead, is for many people a very compelling explanation if those 4 facts are true. And those 4 facts are very well established in historical studies of Jesus. So Tim Keller says, if Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to accept what he said. If he didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about what he said? And so the issue which everything hangs on is not whether or not you like his teaching, whether or not you like Christianity, but whether or not he rose from the dead. And then finally, our 4th clue is through living it, we can actually experience God revealing himself to us, like Sherlock Holmes might sit down with somebody at the end of his deductions and say, I think it was you, I think you were involved. And the person would say, actually, yes, I am involved. Here's what happened. In the same sort of way, we can sit down, we can walk with God, and he can reveal himself to us, and he can show us his own nature through a friendship with him. And that's been my experience for the last 20 years, since becoming convinced by some of these clues at university doing philosophy. I myself said, I think you're there, I think you're real. And then God revealed himself more clearly to me through a friendship. And it became then more than just a sort of hunch or a suspicion for me. It became a real experience of God. And that's what thousands, millions and millions of Christians around the world would point to as part of their experience and what they lean on. So all of these different clues, looking at the universe, looking at right and wrong, looking at history and looking at Jesus and looking at our own experience, all can form part of the clues or the reasoning that might help us to make sense of the question, is God real? But I think God invites each of us on a journey, not wanting to compel us or force us to believe in him, but saying, do you want to know more? Do you want to know me? If so, I think God's up for it. The question is, are we?
Love it. And another question which has come up through this episode, and this is what happens, it sort of spirals out and we get more coming through. So you mentioned about Saul turning to Paul. And when you read the Bible, there's lots of these people's lives that were absolutely transformed. And I don't just mean sort of, I guess, a spiritual transformation. I mean a physical one as well. You know, Lazarus from the dead. And there's so many of these things that you can read the Bible and think that happened, that happened. So the people who saw that would have presumably instantly have become believers because you've got the evidence. But are those sort of things, hold on, Tom's shaking his head here. You're saying, no, that's not the case.
So just because we like to think we're reasonable, don't we? We like to think, if I see the evidence, I'll believe. But I think that, take smoking, for example. Just because we have clear evidence that things have effects doesn't mean our behavior changes. We're mysterious as human beings. And I think you can be confronted with things and still not want to believe or change your life deep down. And that can be as compelling a reason for what somebody believes and how somebody, whether somebody's religious or not, or how somebody responds to a piece of evidence or something that amazing that happens in front of them. It can be there can be other factors that may weigh just as heavily on them as the rational and as the evidential reasons that are operating. Interesting.
Well, I was just about to say, actually, that the thing with smoking is that if you look at the amount of people who smoked 50 years ago, it has dropped significantly. And in fact, it's almost a shock when you walk past and you smell fag smoke. Now it's like, what's that? Oh, yeah, traditional cigarette smoke. But I guess, and again, we could talk about this for ages because there's so many other angles coming in. But I guess the argument with the smoking idea is that we know it's bad for our health now. And will people still be smoking in the next 10 years? Because people smoking, it's dropped significantly, hasn't it? So will we ever see a time when people don't smoke at all because they know it's bad for their health? But if you use that same argument with Christianity, you could say that the numbers, especially in the UK, they're not growing for Christianity. They're maybe dropping for Christianity.
So I think that humanists make a lot of this sometimes, and atheists sometimes make a lot of these stats, and they say, oh, look, atheism's growing or humanism's growing. And I think there is growth occurring a little bit there. But what's happening, Gareth, I think if you look at the survey data of European religious attitudes and religious beliefs, particularly if you look at Grace Davies' work, she's a sociologist who was at Exeter for a number of years. What she's found in her work is not that we're stopping believing. It's actually that belief is becoming more individual and less associated with structures and models of institutional belief. The latent believing that people have has remained fairly stable in Europe and in the UK over the last couple of hundred years, actually. But where people see that those beliefs having a home has varied. And I think that's a real challenge to the initiative taking and the creativity of those who would lead churches and plant churches and grow churches. We've got to come up with other models that relate to people who are doing Sunday morning sports with their kids, or who are blokes who don't want to sit and do sing-song stuff, but actually, we need to find other ways for those people to access being taught and having the Bible helping to solidify and clarify what they believe. Those beliefs that people generally adopt and hold can be a bit vague, and vague beliefs don't confer much confidence. And I think God, as a loving father, wants us to be clear and confident of how he feels about us, what he thinks of us. A lot of people just say, I don't know what God thinks of me. I don't know what God feels about me. And that can lead to superstition, or that can lead to shame, or that can lead to all kinds of things. But one of the things I want to leave people with an impression of this morning is that God is absolutely clear that he absolutely loves you. And that's what's happening in Jesus. That's what's going on. Jesus is God's great love letter to you, saying, here's my son. I'm giving everything to show you I love you. I want to know you. Will you let me help you clarify what you believe by me revealing it to you? You've come seeking, you've come asking, which way do the clues point? But now God says, I want to clarify for you and describe for you how you can really know me deeply.
Well, as always, if there's any questions that you would like us to put to Tom for a future episode, now the list is growing very quickly, but that doesn't mean you can't get in touch. Maybe you're struggling at the moment. Don't feel any shame in that at all. Don't feel stupid asking any questions at all. I mean, look at me. I have to ask them every week. You get in touch with us, studio@konnectradio.com.